And I've gotten a lot of mail on that, Professor Roubini, on the Charles Calamir's plan, which is preferred shares front and center. And I should point out, Ken, the futures were about a 24.60 as the president began to speak, and were there a pretty tight range. And then as he stepped away from the lectern, we broke 23. Right now, 22.00 to the positive direction. Professor Roubini, when you look at this idea of giving the taxpayers a kicker, should it be a preferred share and then out 4 or 5 years with literally what's called an equity kicker, where they get a real participation in these banks, or should it just be a cash flow?
I believe that the form of a preferred shares is the appropriate one, with the option of converting into common shares. And eventually, you certainly don't want the government to be owning the banks. And if there is an upside, then you're going to sell these warrants and make money. And the most important part is not just to make sure there is public injection of capital, but for every dollar of public capital, there should be a matching amount of private money coming from the common shareholders, and also a suspension of dividend payments as a way of recapitalizing the banks. You have to do it coherently that way, and that's not what this plan is doing.
I want to get one more question in here before I throw it back to Ken Prewitt. And Professor Roubini, this is just a sense of your work and of Nassim Taleb and many, many others. Is our framework of risk forever changed? Is the linkage of financial engineering, quantitative finance, and the certitude of things like VAR, is it just forever shaken?
It is, because we realize that fat tail events that should have occurred once every billion years are occurring over and over again, because we've created a financial system that is opaque, it is not transparent, where there's all these new illiquid, toxic, mark-to-model, misrated types of assets, where institutions are not transparent, and where these risk models don't make any sense, and they're not even used properly, because when the music plays, you got to dance, and everybody's ignoring even proper risk management. So we have to really rethink about how we manage financial institutions, how we regulate them, how we supervise them, because these financial crises are becoming more and more severe, more and more frequent, and the collateral damage to the real economy is becoming more severe. We have to really rethink the financial system and how it operates.
Well, Professor Roubini, in light of all you've been telling us about the global financial system here, I can't help but wonder where you have your money.
I'm a long-term investor, so I don't play the market. I invest 100% into equities for the long run, in passively managed funds, because I don't believe in active management, and therefore I think that taking the long-term view is the appropriate one. If I was an active investor, however, this year I would stay away from risky assets, from equity, from credit, from anything is risky. I would keep my money in cash, in T-bills, and I like types of instruments.
Professor Roubini, back to Europe if we could. So many people, Daniel Gross writing today again in the FT of the very unique challenges over there. One of them is with the synergies, their banks are so large, they're literally bigger than the governments. If you've got a given monetary policy out of Frankfurt and numerous fiscal policies and a more confederation structure, how will Europe muddle through this? Is it a Brussels solution? Is it a Basel solution? Does this get thrown in President Trichet's lap?
You're absolutely right. Many of these European banks on one side are too big to be allowed to fail, but are also too big to be able to save, because in some of these countries, the size of the banks are 3-4 times the size of the GDP of these countries, in Belgium, in Netherlands, in Switzerland, and so on. I think that you're going to go to a process through which eventually regulation of the banks in Europe is not going to be done anymore at the national level. It's going to be done at the kind of a federal level, at the ECB or Brussels level. And once that's done, you have to have a pool of resources so that when a rescue occurs, the rescue has been done at the multilateral level, not at the national level. So that's the direction they have to take, because individual countries are going to be too small to be able to rescue their own institutions. So if regulation becomes at the level of Brussels, then the rescue is going to also come at the central level rather than national level.
One of the things we've seen here is smaller banks that weren't doing a lot of complicated financial activities. They weren't buying collateralized debt obligations, and yet they were holding Fannie and Freddie preferred as part of their capital base, and under the regulations, they were in the same category as U.S. government securities. What do you do in that case?
You have a severe problem, because now the preferred shares of Fannie and Freddie have been wiped out, and some of these smaller banks are going to have massive losses. I think that those that were safe and sound should be rescued, and you'll have to find ways to recapitalize them. Again, maybe provision of public capital and matching capital from current shareholders is going to be the way to go. But that's absolutely one of the collateral damage coming from financial institutions having had exposure to Fannie and Freddie. It's a problem for some of those regional banks and for some of those smaller banks.
When you look, Professor Roubini, at monetary theory, I think of you and I traipsing around Davos where there's various and sundry central bankers. Is monetary theory here going to change? Is the ballet of central banks and their interdependencies, will that change?
Certainly, one change is going to be that central banks are going to recognize the importance of looking at asset prices in the setting of monetary policy. You cannot just look at inflation and growth, because we've realized that whenever you have asset and credit bubble, when they get out of hand, then you have financial disaster. So already the BIS, the Bank of England, even the ECB, Tim Geithner and others are speaking about the importance of looking at asset prices, and therefore the traditional approach of Bernanke, Don Cohn, and Greenspan, that you don't do anything when an asset bubble is essentially going on the way up, and then you ease aggressively on the way down. It's a mistaken approach. It leads to moral hazard. It leads to the creation of asset bubble and credit bubble, and you have to essentially deal with them on the way up. You have to use both credit policy and monetary policy to avoid having the problem in the first place, because otherwise the collateral damage when they collapse on the real economy is severe. So that's one of the lessons for monetary theory and for monetary policy.
Our thanks to Nouriel Roubini, chairman of Roubini Global Economics, economics professor at New York University's Stern School of Business.
Hear more Bloomberg News reports on the Bloomberg Terminal at 8.